Welcome to Theology, Imagination and the Arts with me, your host, Daniel Coates-Davis. Today's guest is Justin Brierley. Justin is a freelance writer, speaker and broadcaster who's become known for creating dialogues between Christians and non-Christians. Justin is passionate about creating conversations around faith, science, theology and culture. Through creative use of podcasts, radio, print, video, social media, he aims to showcase an intellectually compelling case for Christianity, while taking seriously the questions and objections of skeptics. Justin has worked in Christian media and cultural apologetics for nearly 2 decades. His recent book and podcast series, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, charts the rise and fall of new atheism and why secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. You can find the book and podcast on justinbrierley.com. Justin, welcome to Theology, Imagination and the Arts.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's great to be with you.
Let's crack on straight into it. So statistics show an overall picture of continued decline of religiosity in Great Britain. However, you recently, for The Spectator, wrote that a Christian revival is underway in Britain. Could you please elaborate what you meant by that? Is it really the case?
Well, the title of that Spectator article, I must admit, was not chosen by me. So I wouldn't actually call it a revival per se. But I do think we're experiencing the conditions that could lead to something like a revival. Because what I really chart in my book and my podcast series, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, is that I think the conversation on faith has changed quite dramatically in the last several years. So the new atheism has basically gone away. It's faded. What it's left behind is a kind of a vacuum, a kind of meaning crisis, actually, in its wake. And I'm seeing more and more interesting people, high-profile people, secular intellectuals, taking Christianity seriously again and kind of offering it as an intellectual option to their audience. So I've seen far more people suddenly becoming open to the idea that there might be something in this God thing, this Christianity thing. And the kinds of conversations that are now possible just simply weren't possible 10, 15 years ago in the heyday of the new atheism. So I'm not saying there is a revival underway, but I'm saying something has shifted quite dramatically. And I just wonder whether we're experiencing what I call in the book a turning of the tide when it comes to that sea of faith.
Yeah, you're using the Matthew Arnold reference there, and I thought that was really interesting, that the tide goes out, but then it comes back in. And that's a comment that I'd never even really thought about. And I was also I thought it was interesting that as a cultural commentator, you're probably the only person I know who actually made this observation that the new atheism had ultimately dwindled away. Because that is actually true, but I don't know anybody else who's really said that. So it also woke me up a little bit, because I hadn't actually reflected on the fact that it does seem to have just passed on, and the next generation doesn't seem as keen to take those almost fundamentalist beliefs. They have some kind of spiritual experience that they want to perhaps open up. And I guess for British people, they do believe in human rights, equality and freedom, what might be known as the ethics of the West, which are, of course, fundamentally Christian. So within this, what do you actually think it would mean to propose the gospel to such people?
Well, I think, as you say, there is a sense that there is still a kind of Christian undercurrent in our country. We are, in very many ways, a post-Christian West. We all know that the statistics on church going, are on the decline, that more and more people describe themselves as non-religious. And yet at the same time, it's interesting, isn't it, that, yes, so many people do essentially still hold to a kind of basic Christian morality. And that's because it has gone so deep in our culture. The assumption that everyone is equal, for instance, equality is kind of a given in our culture. And where does that come from? Well, I would say it absolutely springs from the Christian worldview. Now, whether people recognize that or not, that just is a fact. And I think what's interesting is the more that some of those assumptions get questioned by other worldviews, by, other hegemonic powers out there, Putin's Russia, China, whatever, I think people will start to ask themselves, well, why do we believe in this idea of human rights and equality and the dignity of all people, compassion for the vulnerable? Where does that come from? What's the grounding for it? And I think ultimately Christianity makes sense of that deep sense that most people in the West still have, that these things are important. What's interesting to me is that it's often secular thinkers who are reminding them of that, as I say. So someone like Tom Holland, the historian, well-known kind of broadcaster, co-host of The Rest is History, in his best-selling book Dominion, he really made, I think, a phenomenal case for the idea that actually all of our moral instincts in the West are still fundamentally shaped by the Christian story. And so I wonder whether actually it's a case of partly it's a case of reminding people why they actually believe what they do believe. They may say, well, I don't believe in God. But then if you ask them, well, what do you believe in? I don't think it's too far a step to say, well, I think you do believe in something like a God if you believe in that then, because it's very hard to explain those beliefs otherwise.
Yeah, and I absolutely love the Tom Holland one because he's a secular historian as far as I can tell. And what was so interesting about what he said was that he didn't feel like he related at all to the brutality and sort of absurdity and nihilistic viewpoint of those cultures that were before Christianity, for example, the Romans or the Greeks. You had things that you just would not feel at home at all with. So that vestigial Christianity runs really deeply at the foundation. But often I would say the philosophical and theological dimension is no longer explored at all. And perhaps the relativism that we're seeing is actually in that gap. And relativism, if it's taken to the extreme, it does replace Christianity. I mean, if you think there's no objective evil, that seems to be the first sort of problem. If you can't define what's evil, that's what I find anyway, when I talk to others.
Yeah, the problem is, though, we all end up believing in evil when someone actually mugs us on the street or violates our daughter or whatever. Suddenly evil starts to look very objective, even if we kind of have paid lip service to some idea that, oh, we just invent our morality and everything, is subjective. Actually, it's very hard to get rid of the objectiveness, ultimately, of morality when we're staring it in the face. I mean, what's interesting about Tom Holland is that he's not really making a philosophical case, actually, in that sense for morality. He's merely saying, well, where did the morality we actually inhabit come from? And like you say, it's his own personal story in many ways that frames the book and his case for the influence of Christianity, because he grew up essentially as with some kind of a Christian background growing up, but he kind of had left him by the time he was in his teens. It had sputtered out. And he was a secular historian, starting to write very popular histories of the Greco-Roman world. But the more he spent time in the world of the Greeks and the Romans, the more he realized how very alien it was, as you say, to his values. So this was a world where slavery was just a de facto part of the economy, absolutely unquestioned, where the lives of women and children were cheap, where some people could be the sexual property of others, where when Caesar boasted in his triumph of the slaughter of 1 million Gauls and the enslavement of 1 million more, this was a cause for triumph. And Tom Holland recognized that, given that how he found himself these ideas and values so alien to his own as a liberal modern Westerner, he realized he didn't get those ideas of equality, dignity, and human rights from science or from atheism. They came from something else, the Christian Revolution. It was the Christ of the first century who completely radically reshaped the way we think about all of those things. And so I think it's really helpful that we've got people like him, even secular people, just reminding people that actually these things you believe, they're a kind of rare fruit. And if you do cut the roots off, if we kind of completely lose the Christian story, there's no guarantee that those things will continue to thrive. And so we're kind of in this interesting in-between space right now where people are trying lots of other things, but who knows what the future will hold if we lose the Christian story entirely. And
atheism, as you point out, is actually a reaction to Christianity. It doesn't happen in a void. It sort of comes into that gap. So, and I do actually think from the historical perspective, as you said, there is such an objectivity to history that looking back, we had Dr. William Lane Craig on about the resurrection. It's like, right, if you deny the resurrection, what happened? Or if you like the values that you have, tell me how Jewish people came to understand a certain person, and it's given us the wealth of Western civilization. So even from a historical perspective, you have to give an account, and a sort of hippie rabbi just doesn't seem to cut it in terms of the fundamental dimension. And I guess this leads me to my next question from your article in The Spectator. You describe Christianity as not being a useful lifeboat for stranded intellectuals. If it isn't literally true, it isn't valuable. Can you explain what you meant by this?
Well, there I was commenting on the fact that having seen a lot of people taking Christianity more seriously, some of these secular intellectuals like Tom Holland, people like Douglas Murray, who, when I interviewed him a few years ago, described himself as a Christian atheist, someone who acknowledges that he doesn't believe in Christianity, but yet knows, like Tom Holland, that all of his values essentially stem from Christianity. I see a lot of people kind of saying actually there's something really important about Christianity, there's something really useful about Christianity. I see a lot of people saying, what do we do in the absence of Christianity? Now, the danger is, and what I was referring to there, is this idea that we just need Christianity for its usefulness. It's good to build a culture on these values. And yeah, of course it is. It's good to build a culture on those values. But the only reason those values ever made sense to people was because they really believed in this person, Jesus Christ, and that people were made in the image of God. And they had this belief that they were working towards this greater thing, this kingdom of God. And so it's if the danger is that you've got certain people who want the kind of the benefits. They want Christianity kind of as a useful fiction, but that's not enough, and it won't do. And anyone who tries to kind of just instill values without the story that undergirds them, I think they're not going to get anywhere. And that's why I say we have to believe it's true. I mean, obviously the article came out at Easter, and so I wanted to make that point, that at the foundation of this moral revolution that Christianity instilled was an extraordinary claim that the Jewish Messiah had risen from the dead. And that was what sent those people out to change the world. And we are living in the aftermath, the wake of their belief that God had come in person and had said, every single person is made in my image, and I love them so much, I'm willing to die for them. Now, if you lose that core belief, if you don't grasp that, I don't think you'll ever really get the benefits ultimately of Christianity. You'll have something hollow, and you can kind of co-opt it for political purposes. But again, you're just building more idols at that point. You've got to get back to the real thing. And I think I see people on a spectrum. I think there are some of these intellectuals who are just treating it in that kind of, it's a useful fiction way. I see some people teetering on the edge of belief who acknowledge its value, but also were really attracted to it. And I would include people like Tom Holland in that. In fact, as I'm on a Catholic TV station, I'd love to talk about some of his Catholic leanings in that respect. And then you have got people who have, basically embraced it and said, actually, I'm in. And they may not have worked it all out yet, but I would include people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali in that, who's a fascinating example of probably the most famous female atheist in the world, who,
that was amazing.
In November declared she'd become a Christian, and for exactly these kinds of reasons. So I think, that's why I say, it can't just be an intellectual lifeboat. You've got to believe this stuff.
And you brought up Catholicism, because I remember I saw Douglas Murray for the first time, and it was on a Hoover Institute Decline of Europe interview. And at the absolute root, he said, so what do we need to do? And he sort of laughed, but he said, we need Benedictine monasticism. But he sort of laughed, and I was like, you don't even laugh. That's exactly what we need. That's exactly what St. Benedict did. He saw that Christianity was going to, past the persecution, was not going to have that vitality of a romance of the whole self-gift of the person. And he saw the civilization was on the teetering of collapse, and so he decided to consecrate his whole being in a monastic life, and he essentially developed a Christian spirituality which was an 100% self-gift rather than just this vestigial, half-hearted, tepid, lukewarm. I don't think there's anything more dangerous really for Christianity than Christians living like that, because they're actually doing possibly even worse than if they just said, we flat out don't believe this passionately. Because if you don't really believe it, then it seems almost damaging.
And I think Douglas Murray probably laughed in the sense that I think he probably believes what he said.
I know he does.
I think the laugh comes from the fact that, but that's, how do we put this genie back in the bottle? We can't just, we were in a very different age, and it seems crazy to say that we could go back to something, in the order of what Benedict, instituted. But maybe we could. I guess for me, the point is that people will get to a point where they're desperate enough that they will give God a try. They will give faith a try. And I see that happening more and more, to be honest, because a big part of the book and the podcast series is the fact that I think we are living in this meaning crisis, because the new atheism, if it was anything, was a kind of cherry on the top of a long period of secularization where people have essentially lost the Christian story. But the problem is you lose that story, it gets replaced with something. The new atheists had this very naive idea that it would be replaced by a utopia of scientific rationalism. It wasn't. It's been replaced by all kinds of other quasi-religious stories. Many of them are sort of on the progressive left, sexual and gender identities that effectively become sacred for people, political causes that become their holy idol. and so on. And so the problem is that what you end up with is just a mishmash of culture wars, basically, without any story to kind of give us a sense of coherent purpose and identity. And this is kind of fueling for me the meaning crisis in our culture. We live with, more than we've ever had before, economically, the prosperity, the technology, the science, and so on. And yet we're more unhappy than we've ever been before. We have rising rates of suicide among men. We have a mental health crisis among young people. And it seems to me that you get to a point where you realize we cannot save ourselves. And I think that is what is starting to draw people back to this story. It's why some of these secular intellectuals like Jordan Peterson and others who are drawing large crowds, it's because they're presenting people with the fact that actually there is a better story to live by, even if they don't fully understand it themselves. I think we're seeing just the natural swinging of the pendulum back towards the Christian story, because people kind of have to have something like that to make sense of life.
And it strikes me, I mean, beyond football in general, it's borderline back to it wouldn't take much to ignite the tribal divisions that were before Christianity. Of course, before Christianity, it was warring tribes. It was warring tribes across the world. I mean, the cultures before were, tribal violence, and Christianity brought something so different. I remember in New Zealand, where I used to live, there was this amazing story of tribal warfare, and one of the leaders had, they were doing these revenge killings over and over again, and one of the Maori leaders, he heard the gospel, probably from an Anglican missionary, maybe a Wesleyan, maybe a Catholic, and he heard the gospel, and he was so moved at how his life should be transformed that he probably did the most shocking thing you could do as a Maori leader, because the body is sacred. And he said, place me under the stairs into the church so that every single person who goes in steps on my body. So that's what we're talking about. You see, that was the end of the tribal warfare, led to forgiveness and the humility of a leader who found something that was supernatural, which was transforming that culture, but not for the worse, to bring something life-giving. And I think really the cycle of revenge is one of the main things that Christianity breaks, because the revenge narrative is so obviously, I mean, if you look at films today, they're all going on the revenge trope. It's rare that or just the Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, they've just completely devoid of any overarching narrative. I mean, it's just become very, very confused.
And I agree. I think, there is a kind of natural state, fallen state that humans essentially revert to. I think, again, we fail to realize just how influenced we are in the West, especially by the Christian story, so that we assume, of course, there are certain ways we should treat our neighbor and so on. But those are not givens at all in many parts of culture, as you say. Our primordial state, if you like, is this tribalistic warring one. Now, we may look after our kith and kin, but we certainly don't care for our people who aren't part of our tribe, and we go to war against them. But Christianity absolutely flipped that on its head. I mean, it was Jesus who said that absolutely scandalous thing: love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. It was the Christians who, when, in the early centuries, plague was, going right through the Roman Empire and the cities, they went into the cities and cared for people they didn't know.
I know, I can't believe it,
people who were often their enemies. It was this kind of extraordinary example that led actually to the growth of Christianity, because it gave a place of welcome to slaves and women and children, people who were basically second-class citizens.
And some of the ways that Tom Holland described how slaves were treated, it was just absolutely disgusting. And I'm sure it's
it is to our modern sensibilities.
Exactly right.
That's
right.
But that's the point.
That's the point.
It wasn't disgusting to the people then. And we've got to. We've got to put ourselves in the shoes and see just how differently we see things now. But as I say, I do think we're slipping back, actually. I think, there are other kind of visions of what it means to be a flourishing human being. And you've got the Andrew Tates of this world, for whom it's about, who has the biggest harem. I mean, that's definitely going back to a kind of pagan view of masculinity. And so we've got to be really careful about sort of where people are going to be attracted to in the end. And if we don't have the Christian story, there are lots of other options on the table. Now, my hope and prayer and my sense is that actually a lot of people are realizing if we're going to have Western culture as we've enjoyed it, we need to bring the Christian story back into view. And so I'm quite excited by some of the conversations happening at the moment, where even people like Richard Dawkins are admitting, actually, I think I prefer Christianity to any other worldview that's out there at the moment, competing for the hearts and minds of people.
I've heard him say that twice now. He said Team Christian
Yeah.
in an interview, and then I
Yeah.
think it was at least 4 or 5 years ago. He said he'd prefer to hear the bells in the countryside than anything else. And so
I think he was kind of comparing that to, say, the call to prayer in Islam and so on. Now Richard Dawkins obviously feels, I think his view is, it's the better of two evils, if you like. If you're going to have a religion, I'd rather have Christianity, which is relatively benign and good for us, compared to, say, Islam. Now, what I think he's even beginning to understand, though, is that secular humanism has failed to capture anybody's hearts and minds. It's that's, in the discussion he had recently with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, he kind of said, but the best thing would be to kind of instill secular humanistic values. And I'm like, well, we've failed. That doesn't actually capture people's hearts or imagination. And frankly, it's just a poor replica of Christian morality. It's just been stripped of its.
What was brought into the meaning cycle was a romance, a true romance. Christianity has this depth of love that you can't really find anywhere else. Anything that has that kind of what Tolkien calls evangelion is where the story just swings at the last moment.
What's the Tolkien's word for it? Is it
eucatastrophe?
Yeah, that's right. It is. And
that
I think
sudden
you see
swing.
You see that throughout culture. You see it in so many ways that actually, I think our hearts are set up for the Christian story in many ways, though they can obviously be taken in lots of different directions. But I'm kind of excited by the fact that more and more people are recognizing actually that these other worldviews, these other ways of looking at the world just won't do that. And it's why I think we're seeing, I'm meeting more and more people who are describing themselves now as lapsed atheists. So they're people who have just find that actually the humanist, secular, material story of reality just isn't cutting it any longer. It doesn't inspire them. Tom Holland describes it as pallid and anemic, as a story of reality. He loves the story of the Christian vision of reality, which involves, lots of things that people might think are weird, like virgin births and resurrections and angels and demons and so on. But he finds it far more interesting and actually a far more fertile way of engaging our imagination and our morality. But the interesting thing is, I think there's good evidence for it as well. I think actually, going kind of putting on my apologist hat now, I think actually when you line up secular materialism with Christianity, there's a lot of questions you need to ask about that secular material view of reality. And there's a lot that makes sense in the Christian view of reality. But we've kind of been tricked into thinking that the material view of reality is somehow the default option and you have to be slightly crazy to believe in Christianity. I don't think that's true. I think actually the more that people are starting to see the way in which the secular story just doesn't make sense for them at a kind of experiential level, they're also realizing it's a story that makes sense for their lives. So as I say, Tom Holland's an interesting example of this, he's gone on this intellectual journey. He's kind of seen the value of Christianity. He's kind of one of these lapsed atheists. And then just recently, in my most recent public conversation with him, he talked about some, significant spiritual experiences that he's had himself, actually. One of them was in Iraq several years ago. He was doing a documentary on ISIS, radical Islam, and he described this experience of being in a sort of bombed out church that had been desecrated by ISIS, and just picking up a picture of the Virgin Mary, the Annunciation, and just having this kind of almost out of body experience, he said, where it felt like the veil between heaven and earth was thin, and I think it was also seeing a place where people were actually crucified by ISIS.
Right. Yes, that's right.
It reminded him this was not. This is not just history. It reminded him what the crucifixion really was about, and I think that really kind of spoke to him at a deep level. More recently, he's talked about the fact that he was diagnosed with cancer, and he received this diagnosis at Christmas 2021. Now, he'd started attending one of London's oldest churches, St Bartholomew the Great.
You mentioned in the book, that's right.
Yeah, and so he fascinatingly, that Christmas Eve, was very churned up about this. He'd had this diagnosis, but wasn't sure what the outcome would be. The hospitals were overwhelmed at the time with the COVID surge, and And so he kind of prayed at the end of midnight mass, a desperate prayer, a very much a kind of, I'm not even sure if you're there kind of prayer.
Yeah.
Interestingly, he did it in the Lady Chapel there, which is the one place in London where it's purported that the Virgin Mary appeared to the monks.
Yeah, there
you
you are.
in the sort of 1200s.
Midnight mass, Lady Chapel. You're making us happy over here.
well, the upshot of this is that within a few weeks he was given the all clear, and he says it was the most extraordinary set of circumstances that actually led to him, and it made him even, he said, as a sort of non-believing agnostic Protestant, basically. He suddenly realized, well, maybe this is true. Maybe there's something in this.
I think Jordan Peterson's basically there because he had the same situation with his wife.
Yes.
And so he's got to that cusp now, and we've seen him he went to Latin Mass, which I think would appeal to him. He's interested in the Orthodox tradition because they're very sort of, the liturgies are quite virile and quite, I guess he's a bit of an artist, I think, at heart. He's got that kind of artistic perception. But he's had a lot of similar sort of mystical moments. He's had dreams, seeing the cross. His wife started praying the rosary, returned to mass. His daughter converted. I mean, we've been praying for him forever.
Well, it does feel like the net is drawing in on Jordan Peterson, and he's someone I cover quite a lot in the book and in the podcast series again, because he's always been difficult to nail down exactly what he believes about God. He talks like very eloquently and very positively about Christianity. He's done, he does these 2 or 3 hour long lectures on the book of Genesis and Exodus, and he's just invited thousands of young men, especially, to take the Christian faith seriously again. There are lots of people I know who have walked through the door to Christian faith because of Jordan Peterson. Now, he's a bit hard to pin down himself, and when I had an interview with him a few years ago, and asked him, well, do you believe in God? He said, well, it depends what you mean by God.
Yeah, right.
And that's sometimes the problem. But I agree with you. I think he's going on a journey. The more that I hear him talk about God and surround himself very, very often with Catholic and Orthodox thinkers, people like Bishop Barron, obviously his wife Tammy has now become, a Catholic. And I think that the net, as you say, is drawing in on him. And it'll just be fascinating to see where he goes. All I know is, regardless of kind of exactly where he is on the faith spectrum, I know that he is responsible for making Christianity credible, interestingly, to a lot of people. And that's, again, one of these surprising rebirth moments, I think, that we're seeing in our culture.
Yeah, I've got this little thing that I do in the world. Miraculous medals are medals struck with Mary on it. It says, I am the Immaculate Conception. I give them to people. So I gave one to Jordan Peterson when I met him, and he sort of held it like this. It's called a miraculous medal. So for years, that's been really important to me, and I've always told people about it. I gave one to Charlie Gard's parents. I prayed for them at Ormond Street Hospital, and they've subsequently had another child. But I think from the Catholic perspective, in terms of Jordan Peterson, the only criticism I've heard consistently is he's quite Pelagian. The way he speaks, and you look at his face, it's almost like he teaches that you have to take the weight of the world on your own shoulders, which I don't think is Christian. And subsequently, the thing that I can see from what other people say is that he hasn't got joy yet. Because I guess joy in Christianity is, I don't have to carry this. Yes, and it seems like completely ridiculous that I don't have to carry it. Because I think he's really good at saying, I really should carry it. Maybe like Simon of Cyrene, but ultimately I don't have to carry it. It's grace, it's unmerited grace, it's salvation, and it's the basis of joy. And I don't know quite how he could get himself to there. I don't know. Well, maybe it is he can't get himself to there. That's the whole point.
Maybe. Who knows? All I know is he very often, sometimes he says things and it absolutely lands, and you think, I think you're nearly there, Jordan. And other times, like you say, I agree. There's sometimes the kind of you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, Bucko. That isn't grace, and I think it's important to say that. So I'm not pointing to any of these folks as kind of systematic theologians that we necessarily be getting our theology from, but I do think they are indicative of a change in the temperature in the culture. The conversations that we're having now are very different to what they were. Like I say, that conversation that we've already referenced between Ironhurst Yali and Richard Dawkins, who were both on Team Atheist. Now she's on Team Christian, and even Richard Dawkins has said, well, culturally at least, I'm on Team Christian.
Which is amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and it's a very different atmosphere now that we're speaking into, and you're seeing other people. We've already mentioned obviously Tammy Peterson coming to faith, but Russell Brand very recently has made a declaration and has been baptized. I keep bumping into more and more stories of unexpected people who have realised actually this story makes better sense, and it's even, I think, a lot of this is anecdotal, obviously, and one of the criticisms I've had of the book and the podcast is, well, you say there's a surprising rebirth, Justin, but, if you just look at the raw statistics, church going's going down in the West, more and more people saying they're nuns, as in religiously non-affiliated. And I agree with all that. But having said that, I've just been, in some of the more recent editions of my podcast series based on this, I've been interviewing people actually about the way there's actually seems to even be a shift in the demographics, in some of the surveys that are coming through. So if you go and actually poll Gen Z, the youngest generation, what you'll find is they're actually far more open to spirituality than an older generation, than the millennials and the Gen Xers and so on. And I think it's almost because they've almost missed entirely the new atheism.
They don't know anything.
Yeah, and it's almost they don't even have any religious baggage because they haven't been in church. But it's interesting that I think that even there you're seeing a kind of something bubbling up, a kind of spiritual search. Now, it may be going off in wrong directions, because you've got things like witch talk on, TikTok. You've got young girls kind of looking into witchcraft. You've got, the kind of explosion again of interest in tarot and in Ouija boards and things like that. The Catholic Church is finding itself more busy than ever, actually, with exorcisms and things like that, because people are kind of, it turns out people are still really interested in the supernatural. It's just they go off in the wrong direction.
If you replace God with anything, you're not going to stop being religious.
Absolutely.
You just devote your time or energy to something else.
And likewise, as we mentioned earlier, the kind of almost quasi-religious devotion to certain secular causes, You
gave an example in your book of a pagan convert, I guess, who went through paganism as part of the journey.
Yes, yeah. So this is a really interesting one. So Paul Kingsnorth is a fascinating person. He's a celebrated author and poet in the UK. And he kind of had his sort of teenage atheist phase where he kind of rejected God and any kind of nominal Christian upbringing he had. But he was always really loved nature, loved spending time in the woods, in the mountains. And he said that he couldn't, in the end, reconcile himself fully to atheism. So he became a Buddhist for many years.
That's right.
He tried to kind of find meaning and purpose within himself, through Zen meditation and so on. But even that, he said, he found in the end he wanted to worship something.
That's
and
right.
So he thought, well, I love nature. Maybe I could worship nature. And he actually became, he got involved in Wicca for several years.
That's right,
doing stuff in the woods and whatnot. And it was so interesting because he said in the end he realized Wicca was just a kind of pastiche really of Christian heresies with kind of 1960s esoteric teachings. It didn't really go back to some ancient thing at all really. But in any case, what he did discover was in all kinds of ways. Suddenly he found Christians around him coming out of the woodwork, readers who followed his work, who turned out to be Christians, turned out to be pastors, wanting him to read their sermons. He suddenly started bumping into people that he wasn't expecting. His wife, who wasn't a Christian, quite out of the blue one evening said to him over dinner, "You're going to become a Christian." And he said, "Don't be ridiculous." Right. What are you talking about? Anyway, in the end, he found himself, as he describes it, he was dragged kicking and screaming out of Wicca and finding actually that Christianity made sense. And he ended up becoming Eastern Orthodox. So this was only a few years ago that this happened, and it was a big surprise to his big readership when he announced his conversion to Christianity. But it has completely transformed his life, and he's just one interesting example of this surprising rebirth. That actually, there's a lot of people out there I'm finding. Sometimes it's the storytellers and the poets like Paul Kingsnorth, but it's also sort of some of the scientists, psychologists, actors, entertainers. Lots of different people that I talk about in the book, these surprising converts who are finding actually that the Christian story was the thing they were looking for all along. And if someone like a Paul Kingsnorth can turn to Christianity, then I think anyone could actually. So I would say don't dismiss even the Dawkins of this world. If an Ayaan Hirsi Ali can become a Christian after being effectively the fifth horsewoman of the atheist apocalypse, then again, it could happen to anyone. And sometimes we have to have a bit more faith in a God who kind of is actually behind something much bigger than just the little thing we see in our corner of the world in this moment. Sometimes we look at the West and think, oh gosh, it's going to hell in a handbasket. Atheism is rife and everything else. But actually, that's just one small picture of a much bigger thing that God's looking out on. And so I just wonder whether we're due for that turning of the tide, where actually we may see faith coming in again in our time.
So one of the things that's interesting for me as well, it changed my life when I heard the etymology of worship. It's literally worth-ship. What do you value the most? So in that sense, everyone does worship something, and they might be orientating them towards something that just doesn't satisfy. I mean, if you're going to replace the non-contingent being with anything contingent, like, you don't have a chance. I mean, it pales in comparison on a metaphysical level. It's not the source of its own being. So until you find that touch of eternity, you're always going to be looking at contingent things and not exactly finding that glimmer of truth. But I do often think about, we had just the celebration of St. Paul and St. Peter, and the homily was really interesting. It was like, these are two people. No one will ever do what these two people have done. And it was really just very interesting for me to think of, like, it was honestly like a few people who changed the world. And it wasn't more hell than we have. I mean, they literally, their master had been brutally crucified publicly, and they were all terrible cowards and traitors and just people who didn't have anything to really hold on to in that situation. It really was, it's hard to calculate how your hopes could be dashed if the Messiah has been crucified. It's a sign that he has not been vindicated by God, he's been cursed by God. So that kind of divine transformation, it requires very good quality conversions. It doesn't have to, and those ones get the rest, like it doesn't, it seems to be the case that it just, it's an action of God, so that the numbers is not really the point, and maybe your book touches upon that. It's maybe the numbers in the end, but only if the fire of the Holy Spirit's at the root and just gets a few people. So that's something that, yes, us Catholics we do look at things like that, and so yeah, we'll see how that turns out. Now, I do want to talk to you a little bit about how you understand some of the popes have spoken about the relationship between faith and reason. And I was thinking about this in the context of scientism, which maybe you could explain to our audience what exactly that is. I mean, in my conversation I'm a teacher, I come up across scientism all the time. It's a very sort of reductionist vision, an epistemology that's very myopic. But perhaps you could explain to us how science and scientism are different.
Yes, well, science obviously is the exploration of the natural world through experimentation, observation, and applying what we've come to see as the scientific kind of approach to life. Scientism is different, because that's a kind of more of a philosophical assumption that everything can be explained by a purely scientific approach, that science is the only way in which we can know truth in the world. And the science does not necessarily entail scientism. And this is really important, because this was what the new atheists essentially did. They conflated science and scientism. They basically said there's only one way of knowing what is true in the world, and that is science. And that's why, in many ways, the new atheist movement was led largely by scientists like Richard Dawkins. They saw the way in which science had a really good track record at explaining a number of things, and they looked at religion and other ways of knowing, and they said, well, those simply cannot be as good, and therefore we're going to assume that the only way of understanding the world is scientific. Of course, in itself, I mean, just at a basic level, that cannot be true, because even the very statement, the only way of knowing truth is through science, is itself undermined by that very statement. That's not a scientific statement. It's kind of
a philosophical premise.
It's a self-referentially untrue. It's a contradiction in terms. So just at a philosophical level, it was a kind of, it doesn't get off the ground. But then there's just the fact that obviously it is, as you say, incredibly reductionistic. It rules out vast swathes of human experience and knowledge that cannot be contained within the scientific way of doing things. How do we understand art? Can we understand that in a scientific way? Well, of course not. It's a different way. It doesn't mean that there isn't something that is truly beautiful, truly artistic. Love is not something you can, examine under a microscope. Even, some of the most obvious things we experience in the world, consciousness, taste, color, smell, you might think, oh, well, those surely are the purview of science. Well, science can look at a brain scan and show you what's going on when, you taste a strawberry, but that doesn't explain the taste of a strawberry. That's something entirely first personal and subjective, and something that actually science cannot explain. So there's so many aspects of our experience that simply can't be reduced to just purely sort of scientific phenomena.
I love Bishop Barron because he talks about situations where he just wants to fling his remote across the room. And I can tell you, the one that drives me completely insane is like, where is the mystery? Are you kidding me? You want to tell me that there's this rational evidence in the universe and somehow you can discern knowledge? Like, what sort of epistemology have you got? It's so myopic. How on earth could things be knowable? How on earth could things be structured and organized in a way that you've devoted your whole life? I mean, this is what we meant metaphysically when we said omniscience. All omniscience is that we recognize things are contingent. The non-contingent being must have the perfection of knowledge because it isn't contingent. So even as far as I'm aware, the natural sciences actually emerged out of this philosophical and theological premise. The notion that, I think Chesterton makes this point, the natural sciences emerge at the point where there is a metaphysical foundation that's certain. And
absolutely. Well, it's well known in the history of science that the pioneers of the scientific revolution in the 16 and 1700s were believers, were Christians, and it's not an accident.
No.
It's because their belief in an orderly universe was basically based on the idea that there's a law-giving God and that gives us permission and the kind of ability to explore the universe in scientific terms. So absolutely, all of the founding pioneers of science, Bacon, Boyle, Maxwell, they were all believers, and it was specifically their faith that fired there, and that's why all of the great centers of learning were obviously founded, as Christian places of learning, and so on.
The Big Bang is the argument of
itself,
Big Bang was Father Georges Lemaitre,
Father Georges Lemaitre, the Belgian priest who kind of gave the first sort of sense of the Big Bang as a theory. So in a way, the very foundation of science is absolutely assumes God, assumes order. And then on top of that, you've just got the fact that even to do science, you need this kind of, this universe governed by laws of mathematics and physics. I mean, it's fascinating when you actually look at what scientists who kind of explore the universe at that metaphysical level say about it. So if you read, there's a famous paper by a prize-winning physicist, Eugene Wigner. He won the Nobel Prize for physics. And his paper is titled The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics, in which he describes the way the universe is written to be discovered in the law of mathematics and how this is a kind of basically miraculous. He says we've got absolutely no reason on a purely physical understanding of the universe why the universe should be set up in a way where human minds can basically work it out on a pen and paper. He says that seems like it's either the most enormous fluke or there's something else going on. And I think actually it's perfectly reasonable to say something else is going on there. It's the universe as we see it and written in the laws of mathematics and physics is written because there's a mind behind it. There's a kind of a logos behind the universe. And I think you see that as well in some of the physical aspects of the universe. There's this well-known phenomenon called the fine-tuning of the universe for life, where the numbers and the constants that have to be dialed to exactly the right precision in order for you and me to be here ultimately. You've got the Big Bang itself, as you say. Georges Lemaitre first proposed that, but it was confirmed by Einstein and many others. And again, it raises this whole question of, why is there a physical reality at all? It appears to have come out of nowhere about 14 billion years
Einstein,
ago.
a theist, Charles Darwin, a theist, Father Georges Lemaitre, a theist. A lot of this is history, and people don't even realise the history of that.
Many people have been sort of fed this particular story that was absolutely, enjoyed by the new atheists, that science is somehow anti-God, and it's just simply not true. From the pioneers of the scientific revolution to what science actually tells us about the universe, it's clear that there's a kind of purpose behind it, and so for me, it's helpful that we're just starting, I think, to see people wake up to this. But it's hard sometimes to push against that narrative because it's so deeply ingrained in our culture. But it is, again, part of that surprising rebirth that so many people now are kind of waking up to this and seeing that actually there is this ultimate purpose and mind behind the universe. And
Einstein, he'd said either everything's a miracle or nothing's a miracle, which I thought was quite a good way of putting it. But it does strike me that even there must be a metaphysical impulse towards being a scientist. What is drawing you? These deep-seated drives, they're not simply rational. You've devoted your whole life to them on the premise that there is something beyond that gives the possibility of knowing things. It strikes me that if there was a critical honesty, that there would be a realization that ultimately there's a metaphysical dimension to the drive itself. But
again, the problem is so often people are kind of wedded to their particular worldview and they don't even realize it, And so many materialist scientists, they've kind of just assumed that the world is explicable in purely scientific, physical terms. And it's only, and yeah, I don't know how long it takes for kind of a worldviews to change. But I do think actually increasingly, even in places like biology, which have been very much ruled by kind of materialist scientists like Richard Dawkins, you're starting to see a sea change even there. One of the reasons why it's that's been particularly the kind of the hangout of many atheists is because they assumed, well, Darwin gave us a perfect physical explanation for the variety of life on Earth. We don't need God. Well, even there, actually, you're seeing what's called the third wave in biological evolution coming through, which is actually putting purpose back at the center of living organisms. And it's not simply this blind, purposeless process. It turns out actually that life is far more complex and nuanced than that. So I'm excited to see, even at the very high academic level, people are kind of turning against that materialist worldview. And it may take some time. It may take, the death of a whole generation almost of scientists. But I don't think you can hang out in that kind of very atheistic world for that long before suddenly science, you delve deep enough and you find actually, no, there's something more than just material stuff here,
And in the conversation of the vestigial Christianity we've been talking about, right, these scientists want to reduce everything to matter, ultimately a kind of futile nihilism. What ethical system do you want to construct on this? I think Sam Harris is trying to say there is a moral landscape. There isn't a moral landscape. How are you going to argue it? Why shouldn't I just nuke you? I think nuclear bombs are an excellent example. You can build a nuclear bomb. Should you drop a nuclear bomb? Different question. That is not a scientific answer. That's a metaphysical answer that draws you out of the problem, because it's like, it strikes me that if I say, do you want me to drop a nuclear bomb on you, Richard Dawkins, he'd probably say no, which would betray some kind of ethical or metaphysical impulse just for the sake of consistency. So in any case, we can hope and pray for all of them that they find their joy. So I'm going to give you a few quick fire statements from the popes and we'll wrap it up. So I want to start with John Paul II. That's probably his most famous quote in Fides et Ratio. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth. In a word, to know yourself. So that by knowing and loving God too, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth.
It's a beautiful way of putting it, and I love that analogy of the two wings that are both required to lift an aircraft or a bird into flight. And I think that's absolutely right. It's not a dichotomy, and that's the problem. So often, sadly, in both the Christian world and the atheist world, it's been presented as an either or. Either you believe in reason and science, or you believe in faith and so on. But actually, they're both completely complementary, and they need each other, in that sense. So I absolutely believe in the rationality of Christianity, and I don't believe you should exclude one or the other. And for me, the wonderful thing about the Christian faith is that it brings the head and the heart together. it makes absolute intellectual sense to believe that there's a God behind this, but it also makes sense at a heart level. It makes sense of us as people, as existential beings. And so, yeah, I couldn't agree more with that quote. And I love the idea of that being what gives you liftoff as well. If you had only one wing on an aircraft, it would basically just spin around in a circle and plummet.
He also said
and that's what happens.
Yeah.
That's what happens if you have only one of those two things, reason or faith. You'll end up going around in circles, because we need both.
And he used to say that about the Eastern Church as well. He was like, it's the second lung. We're going round on one lung as well,
Yes.
which I thought was very powerful. But whenever I read that Fides et Ratio, I'm thinking of a snitch. And when the snitch gets caught and the wing's damaged, like it can't, I don't know why, that was always in my head, the snitch, just like it can't fly because one of the wings is damaged. So that's always stuck with me. Pope Benedict, 2012. I think you'll love this one. The Catholic tradition from the outset rejected the so-called fideism, this is the opposite of scientism, which is the desire to believe against reason. Indeed, God is not absurd. If anything, he is a mystery. The mystery in its turn is not irrational, but is a superabundance of sense, of meaning, of truth. If looking at the mystery, reason sees darkness, it is not because there is no light in the mystery, but rather because there's too much of it.
Yeah. Well, again, I love the way that's put together, and I think that's it. Is that, I mean, it kind of goes back to the previous saying that you gave, which is that we don't need fideism, which is just kind of this kind of, I'm just going to believe purely on the basis of kind of my feelings or my emotion, or this idea that it's blind faith, if you like. That's an unnecessary, again, false dichotomy, because actually there are all kinds of ways in which we see the evidence for God around us. It's been said that God gave us two books by which to know him: the book of Revelation in Scripture,
right, yeah.
That's one way, but also the book of nature. So we only have to look outside our window to see the evidence for God in so many different ways, and that's where science comes in. And absolutely, that is revealing the glory and the majesty of God, even as the scriptures themselves say, the heavens declare. And so I think absolutely, fideism is the counterpoint, as you say, to scientism. Both are different ends of the spectrum. They're both equally wrong. We bring both of them together in our faith.
So I'm glad we went through that. So I think the ethical dimension does come out from this balance. And Pope Francis very recently wrote an encyclical called Dignitas Infinita. It's actually brilliant. He's very good at speaking in a secular language and then showing the mystical depth or the spiritual depth of secular impulses. But I think that's really clever, because it does speak to people's experience as a starting point, which was definitely how Vatican II tried to set up the new evangelization. And so he talks about the gospel here, and I think it's something that we touched upon here. So your thoughts on this? The gospel has given life to institutions, that take care of those who find themselves in disadvantaged conditions, such as the abandoned infants, orphans, the elderly who are left without assistance, the mentally ill, people with incurable diseases or severe deformities, and those living on the streets.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about the way that was the DNA of Christianity from its earliest times. This idea that every human being has ultimate value because they're made in the image of God, and that God chose to become human and die for them. So it absolutely, that the instinct there is a very Christian one. And of course, you don't have to be a Christian to believe in the dignity of children and care for the vulnerable and everything else. But if you do believe in those things, it's basically because you're a product of a Christian culture. And again, this is where people like Tom Holland have been so helpful in pointing out how very different other cultures were, both in the present and in history, compared to those that have been shaped by Christianity. So it's almost like, we don't notice the waters we're swimming in very often. And but actually, they are actually absolutely Christian waters. And so, yeah, it was Christians who created the first hospitals, who, created the orphanages that would take people in, who kind of completely transformed our view of healthcare and everything like that. And even, and that's not to say the Christian church has always got it right. Obviously, there have been very dark periods in Christendom when we have used power wrongly, when the scar of the transatlantic slave trade on Christendom. But in those instances, Christians were always going against actually what for me is the core of the Christian message, and so for me there's always been this self-correcting principle, and it was of course Christians who led the abolition movement as well. So I think that it's very hard to see how any of those things would have naturally come about on a purely secular atheistic worldview, and the fact that many secular atheistic people believe in those things is simply a fact. It just simply points back to the fact that they're very, as one of my friends put it, very Christian atheists. And that's the thing, is that those things are not a given, whatever your worldview. But they are things that we've been handed by our Christian culture.
So to wrap up, I do encourage people to pick up this book. I'm going to give you my favourite take from it to wrap it up on my end. My biggest favourite moment was when you got to the prophetic dimension. You said we need to find being weird, not to be afraid to being weird. And I thought that's absolutely right, because it's a weird religion. We follow a man who asked to be crucified upside down. We follow people who prefer to leave everything behind than to live an easy life. We believe in doctrines that seem quite crazy, but they might actually be a superabundance of rationality when you explore them. But that weirdness is prophetic nowadays, to not be half-hearted, but to, as Tolkien says, follow the light unflinchingly. And I guess from us in Walsingham, we're very happy to have you. It's quite a weird place. The Virgin Mary appeared in the 11th century. She said, "Build my house." All the Christian dominations are here now, and I'm dying to have Jordan Peterson on, because he has something against the Virgin Mary, and I think that might be his undoing, because when he understands the Virgin Mary, he's had a miraculous medal. That will be the turning point in my view, because in Walsingham, the saying we have is England's joy resides here, because it's the joy of the Annunciation, and that's where Christmas and Easter and all the joy entered into our civilization. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I do really hope that your work on evangelization and your ministry and all the work that you do is blessed through these two pillars of faith and reason. And I just wanted to give you the final word. What is the hope for Britain today, Justin? What is the hope that the light will overcome the darkness through the finding of Christ in all? Sum it up for us, please.
Well, one of your great fellow Catholics, G.K. Chesterton, I think, put it really well. He said, the history of Christendom is a history of death and rebirth. Things have often gone wrong in the past, and sometimes it feels like it's going wrong today. But actually, Christianity has this extraordinary capacity to be reborn in every generation. And he said, and the reason for that is because it has a God who knew his way out of the grave. And that's our hope. It's a Jesus who knew his way out of the grave, a God who knows his way out of the grave. Whatever it's looking like in our culture, we have to have faith in that same God.
Thank you so much.